So let's consider citizenship in the context of two most valuable achievements of today's pluralistic democratic societies, and I will try to discuss that without trying to preach to the converted, because I think you're kind of all in that area. Those 2 points which I have noted down here are, first of all, the transparency. Transparency, checks and balances to regulate vested interest, essentially to control power. And the second one is accountability. Accountability of those who have earned the mandate to represent our interests, achievements which, well, date back to the Age of Enlightenment, or actually much longer than that. The question I would like to ask is, where do we put science in this picture when it comes to transparency and accountability? Obviously, scientists are not elected, as far as I know. Nor are the criteria of who is appointed to which position, or the decision process of who gets which research grant and who doesn't. The agenda of publicly funded research is mostly set behind closed doors, either in Brussels, in Berlin, in Vienna, wherever. Which means it's not exactly negotiated with civil society. The research agenda, which in the end determines how we live tomorrow, the technologies and the research fields of tomorrow. Who defines the limits of industrial influence on science? We have internationally platforms like Academics Review, or in Germany we now have Hochschulwatch, things like that. Knowledge creation still mostly means that we, as the scholars, mainly trade information, trade papers amongst each other. We even do that in linguistic ghettos, usually using language which lay people have no chance of understanding, which means they don't stand a chance to benefit from this knowledge, even if they have access to it in the first place, whether it's open or closed open access. So the reflex might be that we say open science is the quick fix, the easy answer, which I don't think it is. Actually, this umbrella term of open science, covering open data, open source, and open, what have I forgotten? Open access, of course, yeah. This umbrella term is not a quick fix, only because then the taxpayer may not have to buy the same knowledge twice, this old argumentation, but hence, to which degree is science actually transparent and accountable to the citizen? That's the important question that I'm asking myself. Do we maybe want the... Okay. The technician is back. I waited too long, yeah. Do we maybe want the ivory tower to be the last resort where public institutions are free to govern themselves? Could also be an argument. How much openness can we expect and should we expect of academia? You might argue now, but aren't they obliged to communicate? We have the colleague from the University Press and Public Relations Department here somewhere. I just met her outside. And indeed, communication is finally the most important currency in science. Yet, what is its main driver nowadays? Well, the widespread legitimization for spending taxpayers' money. This legitimization has fostered an institutionalized form of communication with a phalanx of approximately 10,000 science communicators now in DACH, in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland alone, which I find pretty amazing. I mean, times when I was studying, there was one person in the university who did everything. Press department wrote the speeches of the president and still took the calls of the journalists, if there were any. Meanwhile, the traditional business models of media industry, mass media industry, are crumbling while we speak. Crumbling to dust, and new PR intermediaries appear. They're taking the lead. Institutions like The Conversation, which I think started in Australia and now has spread to other countries, which looks like a journalistic publication, but it's actually designed and edited by scientific institutions. Or science media centers, which have popped up, mushroomed everywhere in the world, which have increasingly been criticized in recent times. Or AthenaWeb, where scientific institutions upload footage which they produce themselves, which then means that TV broadcasters don't actually send out any editors anymore because they can download the footage free from the internet, without then, of course, mentioning that it's PR material. So is this form of communication really the answer to our initial question about openness, transparency, accountability? Is this what is meant to fulfill the social contract which is meant to be there between science and society? Let us quickly put this into a more historical context. We usually tend to divide the development of science communication into 4 phases, each of which with an approximately 15-year span. Right now we are witnessing the dawn of the 5th phase. Unfortunately, this study only exists in German so far, but it's open access. You can download it at stifterverband.de/wk/trends. The recent history begins with an age of positive utopia and science fiction in the 1950s and early 60s, which tried to satisfy people's increasing interest in science. The 1970s then saw an age of enlightenment, attempting to educate lay people, literally educate them, a time when scientific literacy was the talk of the town in academia. If we have a look at this, when I presented this in Sweden, the Swedes loved the infographic, of course. The question here is which proportion of our societies can actually tell whether the sun circles the earth, or whether maybe it's the other way around, or whether non-GM, non-genetically modified tomatoes contain genes or not. I'm sure that most of us would be capable of answering both these questions. For those social colleagues who are in empirical social sciences, you have already noticed there is no scale at the bottom, which of course is the joke. It looks much, but the problem, of course, if it is a problem, is that the highest is a bit above 30%. So don't have any illusions about scientific literacy about people in Europe. And that's the EU average down there. Is Austria on there? No, it isn't. Which probably means it's below Switzerland. I would think, yeah. Okay. There's a book which recently came out by Michael Klessens, who was the head of communications, something like that, of the European Commission, or DG Research, I think it was. Very, very experienced practitioner. I think the book only exists in French so far, so it's in the end, he praises the incompetence of people instead of demanding this literacy, this kind of scientific literacy, which everyone has been demanding for years. Maybe a good read for the summer holidays. This approach towards scientific literacy is astonishingly patronizing from today's perspective, but that was how it was defined in those decades. As a matter of fact, maybe we jump back to the graph here quickly, Zach, yeah. Lay people then became more and more critical of new technologies in many European countries, particularly nuclear energy, as we might recall, what we nowadays call the deficit model, a deficit of knowledge. And the attempt was to buy public acceptance for science and technology by means of increasing lay knowledge. If people know more, they will accept it. This is the epoch in which this training offer here, whoop, oh no, it's not touchscreen, sorry. You'll have greasy stains on your screen. So this is the epoch where, in which this training offer here would fit perfectly well in. We're talking about the 70s or early 80s. Unfortunately, this announcement appeared a few weeks ago, I think in April, yeah. Die Presse is quite okay, isn't it? It's kind of not as renowned as the Standard, but not the Kronenzeitung either. The problem here is that it's Bildung, so we're back at education, and it's research results. Is this all that we're supposed to be talking about? Is this all what open science is about? To share the results of something that has already been done, has already been decided, maybe even applied? Let's leave it with this question for a moment, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Well, I would maybe call this unintentionally historic, but I suppose they really meant this serious. Anyway, from the early 90s, research, particularly in social psychology, among other fields, made it unmistakably clear that trust in institutions, in scientific institutions, is by far the most relevant predictor of societal approval of science and technological progress. This trust in institutions was meant to be built in dialogues, which would take people's needs and anxieties serious instead of promoting the presumed scientific monopoly of truth, that we always know the answer, only because we've got empirical data. More than a decade after this German push memorandum, Public Understanding of Science and Humanities, even 2 decades after the influential Bodmer report by the Royal Society in Britain, science communication nowadays is still a one-way street, mostly. It's not about dialogue. It's not about the way dialogue was originally thought. Policymakers today advocate a participatory, which you see here on the right-hand side, a participatory and truly dialogic approach towards communication. The term of the day is public engagement. So let's go out on the street, into shopping centers. Let's involve everyone. Let's be part of the crowd. That's public engagement. Sounds good. Once again, however, this mostly empowers scientific institutions in getting their presumed success stories across. Research results, discoveries, solutions to problems which may not exist. A form of communication which does not sparkle, where the river of knowledge has its source, but rather where its estuary ends up to be. In other words, downstream engagement. The question of the day is, how do we get public engagement in science upstream in the knowledge creation process? Hence, it didn't take long for this relentless drive for participatory forms of communication, which you get everywhere now, to be dubbed the new tyranny. The new tyranny. Wilson and Willis already questioned that in 2004. They ask, are these downstream campaigns really connected to public concerns? Does engagement so far take place early enough for still being able to influence the trajectories of scientific and technological development? Is this early enough to have an influence? Because if not, then means would simply become ends. To give an example, perhaps the biggest flaw in one of the biggest public engagement campaigns in recent years, the GM Nation campaign in Britain about genetically modified organisms, that campaign, the biggest flaw in that campaign was its timing. It took place way too late to influence the direction of GM research or to alter the institutional commitments of the biotechnology industry and other key players. The products were literally in the supermarket shelves already when the campaign started. Let me share 4 short stories with you. Oh, and we have the screensaver on again. What did you do? Just escape. Okay. That's our escape. 4 short stories. Presidential campaign, general elections in America, 2008. You know these people. What a friend of mine did, he got a few colleagues together and analyzed TV interviews with the candidates. 171 TV interviews, did a content analysis of 2,975 questions. And because they had the assumption, they had the impression that science didn't really take place in the campaigns, which probably was right. What would you guess how many of those almost 3,000 questions dealt with something of minor importance, such as climate change, which isn't really an important political issue? How many questions of 3,000? 300? 400? Anyone? 30? Well, that would be pretty pessimistic. Well, it was actually, as you can see, it was actually 6. To put this into proportion, 3 questions were about unidentified flying objects, which might. So this initiated the science debate, which has become the largest political movement in the history of the United States. 800 million page impressions in less than a year, and Sean Otto, who's written this book, is it? Yeah, Fool Me Twice, which is a quote by George W. Bush, of course. Sean Otto initiated then that 178 scientific institutions, learned societies, signed a document demanding for a scientific advisor in the cabinet, which now sits at the cabinet table at every meeting. One of these institutions was AAAS, and then you have the American Association of Biologists and so on. Then they did a survey, which is down here. Oh, I can't click. Yeah. Not supposed to. 85% of the American public then demanded a science debate between those two presidential candidates. They kind of forced science onto the political agenda. Second story. Timothy Gowers, professor for applied mathematics, I think it is, in Cambridge. Not the youngest anymore, as you can see. I think you're at the top of your creativity in mathematics when you're 24. I think that's statistically. So he had been working on this problem. Any mathematicians in the room? I don't hope so. Oh, okay. You can correct me then. I think it's the polymath theorem, yeah, something like that, which he didn't solve or compute or whatever it is. Well, what he did is he opened up a blog, put the question, the research question online, and asked the global community to help him. A few weeks later, they had, what's the term? Analyzed it, hergeleitet. What could that be? Derived, maybe, whatever. The message is here. You know Google Scholar, of course. It usually gives the names of the authors there. If you can see that, it says DHJ Polymath. The blog community communicated its research results under a joint pseudonym in the most renowned mathematical journals, whether it's Elsevier or not. That's why it says there, interactive media as enabling technologies for change in academic communication culture. It's not only the technology itself, it enables a totally different knowledge creation process, changes in the culture of how we communicate. Third story, citizen science, just to maybe touch that briefly. A country like California, which is more or less bankrupt, it doesn't have the money for an earthquake early warning system. They just developed these blue boxes, which cost, I think, about $100, then distributed them all over the place. People put that into their cellars. That hooks into the Wi-Fi network, and within several weeks they had a flächendeckendes earthquake early warning system with just a few 10,000 quid. You have other projects like Hubertus Kohle, who did a serious game-like thing online to attribute artifacts, artistic artifacts, as you can see, with more than 4 million tags in a few months' time. Again, public engagement. And here it's about authenticity. If we really involve people, if we really involve lay people, with all the questions that arise in terms of quality assurance and so on, how do we involve them into the knowledge creation itself? And the fourth story, you have heard of serious gaming, probably. Games like Pandemic, which now is in its third edition down there, where you can decide whether you want to contaminate the planet with bacteria, viruses, or parasites, I think it is. And once that's happened, you can help, of course, the planet to recover again. You distribute vaccines and so on. Up there, you have a game called Folded, which 2 million, particularly young people, are playing in America, or not just in America, mainly in America, but all over the place. 2 million young people spending their afternoons with folding proteins. How cool is that? I don't know how many of you have teenage children. Try that at home. Let's fold proteins this afternoon. Again, the most important message here is not the game, but the fact that nature, structural and molecular biology, is probably not one of the least important journals in the field. As you can see here, you've got the authors again, Folded Contenders Group, Folded Void Crushers Group. Doesn't really sound like an author, because again, I'm an information scientist, I don't have to understand this, but somehow they deciphered the HI virus in rhesus monkeys, I think it was, something like that, within the game. So there was, out of the game, there was a research result which was really more relevant and something that in biomedical research had not been possible for over a decade. Again, things that really change the face of how knowledge is nowadays created. So you see that science communication is actually much wider than what we perceived or what we would expect if we talk about PR and marketing. The intensity of this institutionalized science marketing and the increasing imbalance between what we used to call PR and journalism on the other side, the loss of the neutral intermediary, someone in between, is what worries many of us scholars in the field, because it often denies the need for social inclusion. Science communication remains to be one of the most elitist forms of communication. One example, less than 10% nowadays visit science centers, science museums, science festivals, any kind of event. Yeah? Less than 1 out of 10 people in Europe do that. Redefining the very objectives of science communication is exactly what also drives policymakers and funding bodies at the European level. The Office of President Barroso's chief science advisor, Anne Glover, who's Scottish, some of you might know, recently called for nothing less but a New Deal, which you might recall, of course, from history, which is the title of the pamphlet. And Glover said, betting on technology acceptance by way of good marketing is no longer a valid option for ensuring a good relationship between science and society. A diversity of actors is a must for achieving greater creativity and better results. An early and continuous iterative engagement of society is key to innovation, appropriateness, and acceptability. So it's not anymore about acceptance, it's about acceptability. And it's not anymore about innovation being feasible or possible, but whether it's appropriate, whether we as society actually want this kind of research and technological development to happen. We therefore have to listen better to the aspirations of citizens for new knowledge, demonstrate the usefulness of and the need for new knowledge generation and application. Highlight the economic, the societal, and the cultural value of this scientific knowledge, which often doesn't happen. Be sensitive, be inclusive, and be responsive to public concerns and worries. As much as this almost reads like a promotion of our book project, Opening Science, I do see a problem here. Somehow, politicians, policymakers in Brussels and in national governments still misconceive societal dialogue as a means to enhance the confidence of citizens in science. Enhance the confidence of citizens in science. They advocate a society that embraces science and technology. Wouldn't that be cool? We all know that Austria is the most critical country when it comes to the acceptance of technology in Europe. So this is probably also what some politicians might argue. Oh, we need the Austrian population, the Austrian society to embrace science and technology more than at the moment. Europe being less risk-averse is a political momentum. Yet, do such statements not really indicate that European policymakers still mean public support when they say public engagement? Empirical data rather tells us the opposite. The perceived decline in trust, which does exist. People trust less this how is it called? This myth of science, this naive trust that science can solve every problem. This proportion of the population which has this naive trust in science has been declining for years and years and years, and steadily is going down even more rapidly. Actually, this is more an increased ability of lay people to question and to criticize science instead of believing in the presumed monopoly of truth. Martin Bauer of London School of Economics calls this the post-industrial public understanding of science hypothesis. The scientific citizen is not meant to be a good citizen, But what makes him or her a smart citizen is to be a knowledgeable and critical citizen, media savvy as well, or communication savvy, we should probably be saying today. To be able to look behind the curtain of a communication landscape which has become so vastly complex nowadays. More than that, scientific citizenship poses an epic challenge to all of us. How can we really, how can we see citizens as subjects and not as objects in the process? Taking citizens seriously would make it necessary for communication to not only inform decision-making in the future, but actually shape decision-making, which is something totally different, I would say. The worst-case scenario for public engagement in science would be one in which it is merely incorporated into the bureaucratic process of decision-making without changing the way that decisions are made. Kind of just tick the box, oh, we've done an outreach initiative, we've done our event, that's it with public engagement. Why is all of this so immensely important? I'm starting to wrap up because she's just trying to write the 2 minutes sign. Why is this so important? Let me give you 4 reasons. Because much of public communication in science and technology has simply failed as way of we've done it. Secondly, because science is by no means as apolitical as today's science marketing and PR try to suggest. It's so politicized, more than ever. And if we don't see it as a public affairs challenge, but more as a marketing opportunity, we totally missed the point. Thirdly, because game-changing issues such as climate change are portrayed as controversies in the media, for instance, but actually we only witness yet another manufactured conflict. It is manufactured because the disagreement is not so much among the scientists, but among the stakeholders, among the pressure groups, among the NGOs, who all have their particular vested interest in the topic. And fourthly, because these seismic structural changes in the media landscape today totally redefine the responsibilities of us, scientists, of scientific institutions. They pose a threat and an opportunity, both, very much depending on how you look at it. If you ask a PR manager, then social media will be a threat, mostly for him because he's losing control. He's got the impression of losing control. If we probably did a survey here, we would rather see it as an opportunity of opening the whole thing up, making it transparent and accountable. What counts is to engage civil society as early as possible in the knowledge creation process and not at the end. Upstream engagement versus downstream. To state clearly from the very start how the results of public engagement will be used in decision-making, which often doesn't happen. To empower the citizens in developing an informed opinion on the most complex scientific and technological issues of our time. To make decisions in science transparent, which will be a huge challenge, because it rattles the cage of the system itself. To not only open the treasure trove of scientific knowledge, but also to make sure that scientific citizens can enjoy their newly won riches. In any case, we shouldn't expect them, the scientific citizens, to be scientific literate, only because we believe that this is important, if they don't want to be. But make sure instead that we manage to address their real problems. Think about the research agenda that we cater to and that policy makers finance and fund, whereas in most parts of the world, people are dying of not having clean water and of illnesses which could be totally preventable. If we really looked at that neutrally and sober, I think the research agenda would look different, at least from a societal perspective. For this to happen, last paragraph, science does not need to speak even louder. We don't need another 10,000 science communicators. We don't have to speak louder. But we have to climb down from our presumed ivory tower and listen. Listen to the people and truly listen. If we learned that lay people's knowledge can be just as valid as the most sophisticated, representative, empirical, sophisticated analysis, then science itself can finally become more socially robust, is what I would call it. Imagine scientific citizenship. That's the idea. Thank you very much so far.